Our speaker for this session is Dr. Unni Karunakara. He's president of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders in Holland, and he's a senior fellow and assistant professor at Yale University. He's going to be talking from a very different perspective today, from a humanitarian perspective. The title of his presentation is Equality and Equity from a Humanitarian Perspective. Dr. Karunakara has been a humanitarian worker and a public health professional for more than 2 decades. He has extensive experience in the delivery of healthcare to populations affected by conflict, disasters, epidemics, and neglect in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Dr. Karunakara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you've all had a good lunch. I know how it is after lunch. I should try and get a nap. So just before we get started, I just want to make it clear that I'm not an economist and I'm not an evaluator, but I do live with one, so some of that might have rubbed off. But again, to be clear, I haven't worked on equality, I'm not a development worker, but I have in the last 20 odd years been working in places where people live in extreme poverty and precarity. So I see what is going on, and I have a perspective that comes from engaging in health issues. And hopefully, if I do my job well, you will have no solutions at the end of it, but maybe we can have a conversation, right? All right. So, so you can see the screens, right? Yeah. So equity, I'll talk about equality, but more about equity, and maybe discuss a little bit the difference between both. All right, first of all, what is humanitarian action? So humanitarian action is basically a moral activity that helps people in need. I think we're all humanitarians here. We're all concerned about others. The very work that you do is how can we help other people live a better life, a life with respect and dignity. So that's what we're all engaged in. So we're all humanitarians in that sense. Now, just a very quick brief intro. As a humanitarian worker, I work in areas affected by conflict, areas affected by natural disasters, epidemics. Very often, an Ebola outbreak like what happened in West Africa overwhelms a national health care system, and very often they need outside help to deal with it. And it's not just Western African countries. Even Japan, after the last Fukushima earthquake, etc., for a brief moment, even they were overwhelmed. And this is a country which is perhaps best prepared to deal with natural disasters, right? So countries from time to time need help. Even a country like the US, their response to Katrina was so catastrophic. So there's no harm, there's no disgrace in asking for help. Countries do need help from time to time. And last thing is neglect. Unfortunately, we live in a world where a lot of countries neglect certain groups of people on the basis of race, politics, orientations, and country where I come from in India on the basis of caste. So these are also areas where we particularly work in and a lot of attention. Now, I just want to make a point here. Just because we do humanitarian work doesn't mean that the medicine that we provide is second-hand or any way lesser medicine. The challenge for us is almost always not to cut and paste care that is provided in Boston or in London or in Rome and put it in place in the places where we work, but to take the best practices and simplify it for the field adapt it, but without sacrificing quality. And that's always a big challenge. And that's where the innovation comes in. That's where the all sorts of last mile issues come in. So this is something that we grapple with on a daily basis. Now, very quickly, just to give a scope of what we do, 70 countries around the world, 40,000 people working. Just look at some of the figures. Last year alone, we saw 10 million patients in our clinics. So it gives you a sense of the scale of what we do. And in this slide, you see, just last year alone, we rescued 30,600 people from the Mediterranean. It puts the Mediterranean migration in perspective. Just one organization, with our boats, we rescued 30,600 people last year. Right? So you can imagine the scale of what's going on, very close to where we are sitting today. Just a slide, a short video.
We had a boat coming directly at us, completely full of panicked people. It was so stressful for everyone that they jumped onto us and we had to pull people out of the water. And then when they came to our rescue vessel here, everyone was in a state of panic and started climbing and fighting, and it was a complete mess. We had to rescue 9 boats, plus a small wooden boat, but in the area there was an additional maybe 10 other boats. It was an incredibly complicated situation. Several rescue vessels got involved in the end, but I have never seen anything like this in my time here on the Central Mediterranean. Never.
So when we talk about inequality, this is the extreme manifestation of inequality. This is desperation. This is when people leave everything behind, take their babies, and get onto boats with a really high probability that they might sink and try to get to a place where they can get a better standard of life, right? So this is the extreme manifestation of inequality. Now, just some figures. No clicker. Okay. No pointer. So here you just have figures of how many people died last year in the Mediterranean. So last year it was 3,116, and the year before it was 5,143. These are quite alarming numbers. These are people drowning in the Mediterranean. Mediterranean today is, as I like to say, it's a mass grave. Now, I need to make a clarification. When I say I'm a humanitarian, I want to quickly read this out. This is a speech that I gave at NATO a few years ago, and we were talking to generals about, I don't know how many generals were there in the room, and I was trying to clarify what we do in Afghanistan. So this is what I said. Our purpose is not to bring war to an end, nor is it in conflict situations to build state and government legitimacy or to strengthen governmental structures. It is not to promote democracy or capitalism or women's rights, not to defend human rights or save the environment. Nor does humanitarian action involve the work of economic development, post-conflict, reconstruction or the establishment of long-term functioning health systems. All of that is for others. Humanitarian action is simply about saving lives and alleviating suffering. Now, this is a distinction I want you to keep in mind. I mean, you look at this and say, then, why are you even there? And in a country like Afghanistan, when you have different parties fighting each other, and when almost all of the NGOs that claim to do development are funded by the Americans, which is a party to war, how can you claim the Americans, which is someone's listening in on me. I knew when I say Americans. But the fact is, can you do development in conflict areas? And that is maybe something that we can discuss later. All right. Now, the distinction that I wanted to make here is between humanitarian work, the work that I've done for the last 20 years, and development work. So, humanitarian work is about alleviating suffering, and development work is about alleviating poverty. So that is very clear. And from a medical perspective, we treat patients, and development workers treat systems, right? That's also sort of, but it's also a world view that is very different. We have a very limited view of what it means to assist people. That's a Dunantist view. So Henri Dunant was the founder of the Red Cross, as opposed to a Wilsonian view, which is about better societies, rule of law, democracy, peace, etc., right? These are both very worthwhile projects, but very different in how you envision it and carry it out, right? So we privilege human lives over human rights, liberty, peace, rule of law, and this is very important to understand that in the past 20 years, so many wars have been launched to establish rule of law, whether it's in Iraq or whether it's in Libya or in all of the countries around the world. Keep in mind, rule of law was also used by colonialists. And now neoliberalists are also using rule of law, and very often rule of law is enforced with force, right? And this is something that when we talk about, because rule of law is so twinned with the notion of democracy that we have to question what it means, what rule of law means. And historically, rule of law was almost always to protect, they're more about protecting property than about protecting people. So when we think about inequality at a global structural level, you need to think about all of these concepts. Because we often use these, we often use these terms without really thinking about what historically it means and how it is applied. So rule of law. Human rights, again, it's something that we use all the time in development work, etc. We want rights for people, right? But again, if you look at the history of human rights in the past, the post-World War II period, and especially after the end of the Cold War, Amnesty International has always been about imprisonment and torture. Human Rights Watch has always been about civil and political rights, but no one wants to take on the issue of social and economic rights, right? So MSF as a NGO, a humanitarian agency, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, we all in some way represent a very liberal, Western, Judeo-Christian approach to the work that we do. And very often the problem that I have faced in the field is that liberalism comes into conflict with other isms in the field, other visions of how lives should be lived. So in Afghanistan, it's Islamism. In there's socialism. In China, it's a different kind of ism. So there are different views of how lives should be lived and how society should be constructed. And very often what we do in the name of development is we try to impose a very certain, what we think is universal, but it isn't by no means universal, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. So human rights has also failed the agenda of inequality, because they almost always talk about civil political rights, but when it comes to social economic rights, they have been unwilling to engage in those issues. Citizenship. And if you haven't read it, 2 weeks ago there was this fabulous long read in The Guardian by Rana Dasgupta on the demise of the nation state. You should read it, right? Because a lot of the times what we do is we try and find solutions in a paradigm, in a political economic paradigm that is failing, right? So we are not questioning the big paradigm itself, and we are trying to find technical fixes. Whether it's humanitarian work, whether it's development work, we try to find fixes within a paradigm that is failing. Right? So this is what Rana had to say about citizenship, and that is very relevant when we talk about migration. People crossing the countries and walking across the desert for many days and trying to cross the sea. It's all about what does citizenship mean today, in today's world. And this is how Rana says it. It's a primordial kind of injustice, because where you are born already determines your ability to achieve any kind of equality in the world today, right? So we live in a world where capital can move around freely, but of course labor cannot, right? And that is a big structural barrier to achieving equality. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about, we have 4 humanitarian principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. But I'll just talk about 2 principles because I think they're relevant for our discussion today. The first principle is that of humanity. And humanity is that all people have equal value and dignity, right? And this is about equality. We consider all human beings to be equal, right? So this is central to our raison d'etre. We exist because we believe that all people have equal value and dignity, and they have a right to receive humanitarian assistance, which is very different from the notion of charity. Because charity, there is a giver and someone who receives, and there is no right to receive. But humanitarian assistance, we have over the years fashioned a right to receive, so they have, people who receive have some sort of agency. But if it is the principle of humanity that motivates us to provide assistance, it is the principle of impartiality, the operational principle of impartiality. Here, when you look at it, examine it a bit more clearly, here we come into the notion of equity. Because it does not mean everybody gets 1 bag of rice or everybody gets 1 box of aspirin. It's people who need aspirin most will get aspirin. So proportionality is a very important principle. And so here we get into the notion of how you distribute services. So distributive justice, right? And so the first principle is about equality, but the second principle is largely about equity. So this is the difference between when we talk about inequalities in health, especially in health, when we talk about inequality and equity, what equity has, which equality doesn't have, is that notion of justice, that people who need it most get it, right? So now I can't even begin to comment on how you can apply this in the work that you do, but in health it's important because it helps us target services better. It helps us manage resources better. So the principle of equity helps us get our work done, right? So the route to achieving equity is not by treating everybody equally, but then treating everybody according to their circumstances, right? And again, the notion of social justice is very important. And someone talked about disparities earlier today, and this is again what we try to do in public health, look for differentials and between gender, between race, between groups, and then try and address it in the best way possible. Now, this is, of course, Joe Stiglitz, who talks a lot about globalization, and and I think the person from Oxfam raised this point earlier today, that we have to really look at what's happening at the top. So it's not just about fixes in rural areas. There are structural barriers, the politics today, the economics today, that actually has inequality is, in some would say, a very deliberate result of the policies that have been crafted. It's not an accidental result. It is a deliberate result of the political economic choices that we made, right? Now, another notion, we talk about philanthropy. Today, Bill Gates is the global minister of health. The amount of money that he puts into health it's huge, and I applaud him for it. But the moment you question Bill Gates about his investments in pharma companies, in companies that oil companies, defense companies, then you can't have a conversation anymore. So it is, okay, I'll make my $100 billion and then I will give it away, but how do you make that $100 billion? Right? And that is also a conversation we have. So in this world today, since the 70s, there has been a very concerted effort to scrap away regulation, one by one. 94% of Apple's profits are offshored. $250 billion, which is more than the reserves of the British government and the Bank of England together, right? This is one company. So, something to think about. Now, you can't read this slide very clearly, but it's from a book talking about the different ages of humanitarian action, or you could apply this for development as well. But let me move on to where we are today. We are no longer living in the age of human rights. Human rights was a big concern after the fall of the Soviet Union. But now we are living in the age of security. The moment security is invoked, human rights is no longer a concern. You can see it from the policies that the US government, but also in Europe, but where I come from in India, all of these countries have policies that are slowly eroding privacy, but much worse than that. So we're living in an age where we have religious militancy, ethno-religious states, finance is deregulated, even technology today. The functions that were formerly that of the states, surveillance, cartography, who does it now? Google does it, right? Citizenship. Facebook is, I don't know, the 12th largest country in the world or something, or maybe even more, right? Notions of citizenship are changing. Nation states are based on their ability, or they exist because they are able to control their own economy. Digital currency, right? It is also going to change nation states a lot in the future. So these are things that you need to think about when you think about inequality. We can no longer think of it in a national, sort of use the nation state as a unit. We have to somehow start thinking bigger. So nation states and inequality. And this is very important. The reason nation states were able to deliver what achievements it did in the last century was that for a brief moment that the scale aligned, the nation state, the economy, the politics, and the information that they control all aligned for a brief period of time. And now it is no longer the case. Right? And if you think it is not the case for the US, it's impossible to raise taxes anymore. It's just something you cannot do. Right? So then how are they going to provide services? How are they going to repair the roads, crumbling infrastructure, etc., right? So we are at a moment where we need to think about, if economy is supranational, if information is supranational, then politics need to be supranational as well. And if politics is supranational, then do we not need to start thinking of development solutions supranationally as well? I don't have the answers. I'm just throwing out. It's very easy to throw a bomb into the. So very quickly, I want to go to some of the challenges that we are facing in working in the places that we do. Right? One is insecurity. I don't need to say, this, you can't see the slide clearly, but this is all of the conflicts since World War II. Right? After World War II, we created the United Nations with the singular purpose of fostering peace. Right? I think it has failed. Right? And so if you look at it, the number of conflicts that are going on. So again, we are living in the age of security, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and security. Now, the important thing about securitization is, countries are very good at presenting problems as an existentialist threat. Now it is, if you want even a health issue to be taken seriously, it has to be presented as a security threat. HIV/AIDS was the first one, but Ebola, what was in Brazil, Zika virus, they all presented as a security threat for it to provoke an action, right? And then it leads to a response which even sort of is willing to dismantle hard-won international sort of agreements, like the Geneva Convention, for example. And this is Denmark. Scandinavian countries for the past 30 years have considered themselves, claimed the moral high ground when it comes to human rights. But even they behaved abominably in the past migration crisis. I'll give some marks to Sweden, but the other countries sort of did very badly, right? So they're willing to kind of get rid of the Geneva Convention. But then, more importantly, the solutions that are proposed are completely unconstitutional, right? And what allows them to do all of this is the language of security, because then they can circumvent everything, even the Constitution. All right, and I want to give you very quickly a case of a well-intentioned program that sort of achieved the very opposite result. So in the US, they undertook an immigration reform in 1965, and this was they wanted equality. So they were at that stage in the 60s, migration from Asia and Africa were almost sort of zero, and free across the border from the south. Mexicans could come into US, they would work during labor season, and then they would go back. So there was that flow of migration. So they wanted equality, and they achieved that all countries will get 20,000 visas a year. Right? So that was equality, they wanted to achieve it, and this is what happened. So suddenly, migration, which was almost very little from Asia, suddenly exploded. From 11% to 40% of migrants were from Asia. But what it did was, it criminalized historic migration from Mexico, from the south of the border. Before they could come, they could work, they could go back to their families that were living in Mexico, but now they were suddenly lawbreakers, they were illegal, so then the border became militarized, right? So that's how it goes. It was a well-intentioned policy which was not really thought through very well. So, and this is also, in some ways, you need to start think of it in equity terms, right? And it is not that the migration from Mexico ever increased during the whole period. It remained stable, but suddenly, because of this one law, it became illegal. And that changed the whole nature of discourse. From them being useful for American economy, suddenly they became, they're bringing drugs, they're raping our women, etc., right? Which you've probably heard the current president say as well. Impunity. So I talked about insecurity, impunity. This was our hospital in Afghanistan in Kunduz that was bombed in 2016, right? 44 colleagues died. 44 people died, 14 of them were doctors, nurses, etc., who were working in the hospital. Okay, I won't spend too much time on it. It was a criminal act. The problem today is there is no one holding the stick. There is impunity. And Rana Dasgupta talks about it is gangsterism, basically. They can do what they want. 4 of the 5 Security Council members today are part of coalitions that bomb hospitals. Where is the outrage? Who is sanctioning them? Okay? This just gives you a sense, this just civilian casualties since World War I. You see, and all this goes to inequality. These are structural conditions that, perpetuate inequality in these countries. So 14% of people who died in World War I were civilians. And in today's conflicts, it's 95%. So the destructive power of ammunition, you can sit in Nevada eating a Big Mac, press a button, and people will die in Pakistan. Right? Warfare has changed. And this is another interesting slide. If you want to talk about inequality, here you have the same events during a certain period of time, same events that were counted by different groups. How many civilians died in drone attacks in Pakistan? Right? It's exactly the same events being counted. So Long War Journal counted 102 civilians, and the Pakistan body count 2,089. Why this discrepancy? Because this is the Obama administration's definition of who a combatant is. Right? So, and again, when you talk about inequality, if you just happen to be a young man in Pakistan in certain areas, you're automatically considered a combatant. You can reclassify your status after you're dead, but not before. So you're guilty until proven innocent. Right? Indifference. I think there's just so much happening, we just have only so much compassion to give, compassion fatigue. Right? 65 million refugees. We are almost always focused on the refugee flow in the Mediterranean, but it is important to notice that the people are moving all over the world. Right? And we waste a lot of time talking about, are they political refugees, are they economic refugees? People are moving because they just can't, their lives are unbearable. Whether it is due to conflict, whether it is due to, multinational companies coming and raping their natural resources in Congo, it doesn't matter. People can't live in these places anymore, so they're on the move. Right? So again, Article 14 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundational document for our times, clearly says that people have the right to seek asylum when they feel they're being persecuted. Right? But of course, we put obstacles in the way of people getting to countries, getting to Europe, and I don't want to put all of the blame on Europe. My country, India, has taken 0 refugees. China has taken 0 refugees. Many other countries. This year, US has accepted 12 Syrians. Right? So it's not just Europe's burden to bear, it is for the whole world. Dehumanization is something we know from Nazi times, that is the first step. Even in Rwanda, just before the genocide, one group were talking about the others as insects, etc. It's happening again. Look at these headlines. Today's migrants are swarm on the streets. So you dehumanize them so that you can do things to them that you wouldn't do to other human beings who live next to you. Also notice that really nice headline of why we all fear dentists are natural born killers. Very important thing to discuss maybe later. And then the response, send in the dogs. These are headlines in newspapers in the UK. Send in the dogs, right? Next challenge, institutionalization. So 2 years ago, the international community came together, World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, to address the problems that we all face. They came out with a grand bargain, right? So they made all of these very important decisions. But in the middle of the refugee crisis, no talk of refugees, no talk of protection of civilians in war. The important questions remain undiscussed, right? Because we live in an environment where these issues cannot be discussed anymore, right? This is another slide I created 2 nights ago. It's looking at expenditure in the UN system. And you see for the first time in the last 3 years, humanitarian spending is going above development spending. That means now the UN is focused on the short term, right? Medium to long term, so much more money is being spent. You see the crossing? The much more money is now being spent on humanitarian issues. And at the same time last year, WHO, which is a norm-setting organization, decided that they were going to create a health emergencies group. Like UNICEF, they also want to be responding to emergencies. And I will make a prediction today. What will happen is that essential norm-setting functions of the WHO in a few years will get underfunded, because it's always what's happening today that gets funded, right? And this is also something that you need to, from a systemic perspective, the funding for development activities are going to go down, and it's going to be more humanitarian work. Very quickly, so there are many reasons why people don't have access to care, right? And this is talking about a manifestation of inequality. Now, and we did our own analysis, and even though we focus on patients, we decided that there are these structural barriers that prevented people from getting the care they need in the places where we work. Now, why do we fight for access? I'll very quickly go through it. It's just that people don't have the treatments they need, either because the companies are not making them because there's no profit in it, or because even when it is available, it's available in richer countries and not in poorer countries, right? So this is, for us, the equity issue. Access is the equity issue, right? So people who most need it don't have access to it. So that's because there's a market failure. Because if you leave it to the private sector to find solutions for problems that need to be addressed by the public sector. Because there is a myth that is perpetuated that the private can do anything and everything better than the public system, right? To some extent it's true, but of course it doesn't take into account the responsibility, the social justice, equity. These values are not valued anymore. And okay, this is Joe Stiglitz again talking about why the market has failed. Now, I won't go into this. This basically shows that the diseases that affect poor people don't get the money that they need to address the problem. This is very important. In 1999, there was not a single person in the continent of Africa who had treatment for HIV/AIDS. Because the cost of treating one person for HIV/AIDS for 1 year was $10,500, right? So even if governments wanted to provide treatment for free, they could not afford it. $10,500 per person per year. One day, an Indian company walks in and says, we'll make the same treatment for $1 a day. And then immediately the price comes crashing down, and today the cost is less than, it's about $50 per person per year. They're still making a profit, right? So this is something that you need. The markets are structured in a way that poor people don't have access. Even in industry like pharmaceuticals, which is, it's not like royalties for music. This have life and death implications. So then you have situations like this, where hepatitis treatment is $84,000, and the actual cost of production is $300 to $500, right? And then you have Pfizer, who makes $11 billion on a pneumococcal vaccine, right? And Gates Foundation is willing to subsidize them for $40 a pop. They are willing to pay $38 so that countries can have it for $2, but they will not enter into a discussion with Pfizer on how you can actually make affordable vaccines. That's not a discussion, right? So these are things that we need to, because the poorer parts of the world cannot live on handouts. They want to be able to afford treatments. They want to be able to provide so that but they're not able to. Okay, we're coming to the last slide, and then trade agreements. Even though even though we think countries have the right to decide what kind of treatment, what kind of healthcare they should provide, really they don't. Because today we have WTO, we have the trade agreements, which are heavily influenced by big industry, so that trade policies are very often skewed towards the rich and not towards the poor. And that has further implications. In fact, in the TPP, there was a provision where they wanted to patent surgical procedures. That means if there was a surgical procedure that was developed in a hospital in London, and if I did that procedure in the field in Congo, then I would have to pay a royalty to save someone's life. Right? Luckily, that was taken out of the, after much lobbying, it was taken out. But these are these are the kind of, this is the extent to which they're willing to go. So we need to be mindful of that. We need alternatives to the current IP system. And believe me, I'm not against profits, but I am against profiteering. If each of the top 11 pharmaceutical companies are making about $11 billion in profits, and still their medicines are not available for people who need it, there's something wrong. Right? So we need to fix the system. If you're serious about addressing inequality, it's not a technical fix. It's a political fix that we need to find. I'm coming, there's the last few slides. Okay, so the point that I want to make is there are no humanitarian solutions for humanitarian problems. Simple. And this statement was made by a head of UNHCR many years ago. There are no humanitarian solutions for humanitarian problems because the solutions are political. Right? Hall of Fame, you recognize everybody in that, and basically it says a lot of the problems that we are dealing with, inequality, war, conflict, it's because of immoral choices that have been made by other people, so political leaders, corporate leaders, etc., and we have to address it, right? So, even though I've been a humanitarian for 20 years, humanitarianism is emblematic of failure. It means we are there because politics has failed. Communities have failed to live in peace. Governments have failed to provide the services people need. UN has failed to bring peace between countries. But what we do is essential action. It's necessary action in the absence of political solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You have raised so many points that I'm sure people have questions on. I myself have a lot of questions, but because our time is a bit limited, let's start and see if anyone in the audience has some questions for you, maybe even solutions. You threw out a lot of challenges there. Any questions from anyone at the moment? Remember also that you can post your questions on www.menti.com with the code 68628. Maybe I can start with a question while everyone's thinking. You speak about development and humanitarian work as quite separate things, perhaps on a continuum, but at very separate ends of it. But what can inequality and access to healthcare and some of the other issues that you raised be addressed without the development action?
Yeah. No. So last year I spent a month in Bukavu in Congo, and there was no real outbreak of violence. So people were going about their business. The clinics were open, etc. So there was a big discussion whether now we are in a development phase in eastern Congo, right? And that's when you realize, when you engage with Ministry of Health, they are still, development is a contract between citizens and their governments. I personally believe it's very difficult to impose development from outside, right? So what we can do is help countries get to a point where they can make their own choices. So for example, if we elect Trump, we know what kind of healthcare we will get or not get. If we elected Bernie Sanders, you would have a different healthcare. These are political decisions. These are not technical solutions. That's the point that I'm trying to make here, right? So I can work with the district health officer in Congo, but when the stakeholders are not around the table, what is it that we provide? Are we providing free health care? Are we going to have some sort of single-payer system that will, you know, like an NHS type of system? These are political decisions, right? And as long as countries are not in a position to make these political systems, everything that we do will be some sort of band-aid. That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Does anyone in the room have different opinions? Yes, there's a question over here.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Prashant. I work in the Office of Valuation of IFAD. While I was listening to you throughout, I started thinking about it in terms of a certain continuum of time. And the way I see it, everything that you spoke about, you know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, Geneva Convention, equity, equality, universal access, so on and so forth, liberté, égalité, fraternité, I see a common trend there. All of these were devised in the aftermath of a horrible catastrophe. French Revolution, not a catastrophe, but an event of a lot of significance for the country or for the world. Similarly, Second World War. After that, you know, you had this era of idealism where you spoke about, you know, equality of access, equity, you know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, refugees, you know, accepting them and, you know, and protecting individual rights. But as time, at least I would love to hear from you what you think. As time passes, what was earlier considered the norm, the central stance in a political system, moves further right to this thing, because the generations keep forgetting what it was like before. And probably in some ways, you know, the general population starts taking it for granted. So in some ways, we ourselves become the enablers of the inequity or inequality.
Sure.
That we live in, rather, in some ways. What do you think?
Yeah, so that's the point also what Rana Dasgupta makes in his paper as well, that moment of alignment where nation states were in control of their own destiny is sort of over, because they cannot control their capital anymore, because capital flight is a big deal, offshoring, etc., right? So when that is not controllable, then things get out of hand. And so a lot of what we see in Hungary, in Turkey, in India, in the US and other countries, what we mistake for strong states are actually, according to him, the last dying gasps of nations that are not able to control its own. So they resort to authoritarian measures, right? So, yeah, we will see how it all plays out. But clearly there's something in the air that there's something quite not right. And maybe we are ready for the next manifesto. We are ready for the next political, economic. Clearly history is not dead. As Fukuyama said in 89 or 90, clearly history is not dead. So we need to figure out what shape history will take as we move on.
Thank you. Anyone else? There's a question over here, and we'll come there next. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Gabriella, and I work in the Program Management Department. I have a very quick question for you. We have heard from you that as humanitarian assistance must be neutral, by definition. In your opinion, has also development to be neutral?
Yeah.
So I'd ask you just to hold on that question. Let's take another one and you can answer them together. Question on the side here?
Yes, my name is Florence Siegel. I started my career in MSF, actually. And I do not agree, and that has been one of my problems with MSF recently, is that separating humanitarian work from rehabilitation and development, I think, is not a good idea. I agree with you on failed states. I don't believe, therefore, that national development is necessarily the solution, but if we work at local level with people that are suffering, whose lives are at stake, it is also important to realize why and what, if anything, can be done. I agree that people are not interested in rights any longer. I agree rights are very specific to the areas in which you work, but there are some basic rights that are important. I think one of the reasons there is so much money going into humanitarian aid, it's a great way of distributing goodies, and the private sector is very happy with that, and I'm sure that Pfizer is very happy that Bill Gates is paying for the money there. I'm sorry to be a bit controversial, but I do believe our responsibility would be, and I have been working on my career in development, if you have a humanitarian crisis somewhere, it means that there you really have had a failure of any development process. It's important to try and see what can be done, and we should use that as priority areas to restart a thinking, a participatory thinking grounded in people's culture and history and not into what the capital city decides. I've worked in Afghanistan, and our problem was people were saying, okay, fine, you're not going to give us any money. Now, if I take a Kalashnikov and shoot 10 people, we are going to have a humanitarian program there. So is that what you want us to do? Because we are not going to get any other option. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So
I fully agree with you. You are not being controversial. You're actually saying exactly what I'm saying. Like we do, when we work in Afghanistan, we train people, we work with people, we address issues. But please don't mistake that for development. That is what we do while we are there, right? Development will happen when the majority of the Afghan people have a say in how they can build their society. Right now, majority of Afghanis are in areas controlled by Taliban, right? The government of Afghanistan, the president of Afghanistan is really a mayor of Kabul, right? So that is what I was trying to say, is that yes, we need development. We need, but development in the right way, where people have a say about their own future. So just because the US government pumps in millions of dollars in Afghanistan, it is not development work. And we have been working in South Sudan for 35 years. And we talk to everybody. We work with the Ministry of Health, but it's not development. It is just provision of care. So that is the distinction that I wanted to make. Now, the neutrality of development. The problem is, development is a political process. It has to be political. You're making political choices. You're talking about what kind of society you want to build. What is the role of women? How do you deal with different political viewpoints? So it is a political process. So if you go to East, to Japan and to China, they value, communal rights much more than individual rights. That's a choice that you make. While in the US and in Western countries, individual rights trump all other rights. These are choices. These are political choices you make. So that is the problem with neutrality. In Dante's Inferno, neutral people always went to hell. And they were in the worst part of hell. And they were chased by bees and hornets. Because Dante considered neutral people too lazy to form an opinion and to, But we're talking about, neutrality is not an option in that sense. You have to, because these are essentially political choices that we make.
If I may, if I can just quickly ask, I see we've got 5 minutes left. You're posing a lot of serious challenges. We're in the age of security. Humanitarian assistance is a band-aid on the problem, yet development work cannot be effective without the political will. So what is a way forward? How would you think we need to move forward in this age of security, of achieving equality or a more equitable life in rural areas?
No, because we need to ask the tough questions in New York and in Geneva, I think. Because right now, this is a bad sign. That if more of the international money is going on humanitarian assistance, that means we are giving aspirin for someone who has a brain tumor because we want to deal with a headache while the tumor grows. Right? We are not removing the tumor at all. We are just giving aspirin for headache. And that is, you can think what you want of it, but that's how I think of it. Right?
I think that's a big challenge to a lot of us in the room here. Is there any one last question anyone wants to ask before we wrap up? Yes, we've got one question over here, the final question. Sorry, the microphone is moving very quickly towards you.
Question and a comment. That the issue of inequality is maybe one of the largest challenges that we have in Latin America, because it is not the poorest region in the world, but it is the most unequal. And unfortunately, the two biggest countries, and one of them is mine, Mexico, Brazil and Mexico are the most unequal ones. Being at the same time, the strongest economically speaking. And even to tackle this debate in Latin America is not easy. I remember in 2004 we had the summit EU Latin America, and the EU suggested to tackle with the title Social Cohesion, how to tackle inequalities. And it was very difficult to convince the countries to accept that discussion, because they wanted only to tackle fighting poverty, which is different. So I would like to hear your opinions about these, because we have in the Agenda 2030 fighting poverty, which includes rural poverty, fighting hunger, and at the same time the SDG, sorry, I was thinking in Spanish, ODS, the SDG on tackle inequalities. How would you approach that link between ending poverty and tackling inequalities?
Yeah. So
just a little question.
Yeah. And I have 30 seconds. Right?
Yes.
No. So we live in today there are no leaders who have been able, no political leaders who formulate inclusive policies. If you look at all of the countries, it's all about keeping certain people out or keeping certain people away from, because they are the threat to your growth or to whatever, right? And I think that dialogue needs to change. We need to have people and politicians and leaders start making exclusive policies where you talk about cohesion, that when the water rises, all boats rise with it, right? So it's not that if you want to stay afloat, you have to sink the other boat, right? And that sort of thing is because, I think that is also because the countries are no longer in charge of their capital. I think there's a bit of a panic situation going on. And then what happens is that nationalism project is all about demonizing the other. For nationalism to succeed, you have to have a threat to the nation. And today, those are the migrants, people coming from other countries, even though for many years, during good times, they were seen as an asset. They were the engines of growth. And in many countries, that they were the ones who were going to address the demographic problem in some of the northern European countries, where there's very little money going in for social security because, you know, of the fertility rates, etc., right? So I don't have any solutions. I'm a very optimistic person, but, you know, I'm a bit like in Voltaire's Candide. Things are going, I'm tending to my own garden, but it's a bit like that. But we need a new dialogue. We need new politics, and we need new economics, I think.
Dr. Karunakara, thank you so much. I think that was a very challenging presentation, and I think a lot for you to all think about in the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Just before we move on to our next round of breakout sessions, which focus on resilience, before you choose your session, let me just tell you a little bit of logistical information about what happens next. The breakout sessions will be followed by a cocktail reception for everyone at 6 p.m. or maybe later if we're running past, which is outside the executive dining room in the same place we had lunch. And don't worry about transport after the reception. We've made arrangements for a bus to take you to the nearest metro stop, or you can also call for a taxi at the security gate. So please consult your programs for information about the coming sessions and enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.